People often say that time heals all wounds. But the truth is, some scars never fade, and maybe they're not supposed to. They remind us of how deeply we've loved. This story isn't about loss. It's about transformation, about how pain, when faced head-on, can become the very force that lifts us to something greater than we ever imagined. Get ready to hear the true story that touched hearts across the nation. The story of a man who left too soon but left behind a legacy strong enough to span generations. A story that proves real heroism isn't just found on the battlefield, but in the quiet, everyday choices of those who decide to keep moving forward, even when the road is unclear. If you've ever felt crushed by grief, if you've ever wondered whether you had the strength to keep going, this story is for you. It will show you that the greatest victories don't happen under bright lights. They happen behind the scenes, in the silent moments no one sees. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of this journey, you'll realize that the toughest battles aren't fought out there in the world, but deep within ourselves. Chris looked at Britt that Sunday morning, as if the whole world lived in her smile. It was one of those rare moments life hands you without warning. A positive pregnancy test, and two hearts racing with joy and fear all at once. They both knew time was slipping through their fingers. In just a few days, Chris would leave for Afghanistan. But sitting together on the living room floor, between nervous laughter and whispered promises, they started to dream about the future of a baby who was no bigger than a seed. Chris promised Britt he would come back to hold that tiny life they already loved more than anything. Even though deep down they both knew how unpredictable life could be, Chris kept a steady smile while packing for his deployment. Every shirt he folded, every photo he tucked away was his quiet way of tying the present to a future he was determined to see. In those final days, they talked about baby names, joked about who the baby would look like, and planned how they would set up the nursery. When fear crept into their conversations, Chris would chase it away with a bad joke or a tight hug. It was his way of shielding Britt and himself from a reality neither of them wanted to face. The goodbye at the airport was quick, almost rushed, as if dragging out would only make it harder. Chris turned one last time before boarding, pressing his hand to his heart in a silent message. We're connected, no matter what. Britt gently rested her hand on the small curve of her belly, smiled through tears. In that moment, they made an unspoken pact. Their love would be strong enough to cross oceans, deserts, and wars. What they didn't know, and maybe it was better that way, was just how much they would need to hold on to that promise in the dark days ahead. The dust of Afghanistan clung to everything but the hope Chris carried in his heart. Even on the other side of the world, in the middle of the burning heat and distant sounds of war, he found time to connect with Britt and the baby he hadn't even met yet. At night, during short breaks between patrols, he would record sweet, sometimes silly videos, speaking to the little life growing back home. Chris talked about his dreams, about teaching the baby how to throw a ball, about the stories he couldn't wait to tell. It was his way of building invisible bridges over the vast distance that separated them. Britt clung to every message like someone waiting for a bottle to wash up on shore. Chris's words were like a warm blanket in the cold loneliness of missing him. She sent him ultrasound photos, described the morning sickness, the weird cravings, and even played music for the baby so Chris could feel connected. Together, they created their own world, made of audio clips, videos, and promises, a place where the war couldn't reach them. Sometimes, Chris would speak directly to the baby in the recordings, calling it my little warrior or my tiny star, as if making sure the child would always know who he was. But there were days when hope and fear blurred together. The distant echoes of gunfire, the dangerous patrols, the rising death tolls. They wrapped around Britt like a cold fog. She would grip her phone tightly, listening for life in his voice. And Chris, miles away, swallowed his own fears to keep sending pieces of love across the ocean. Every video, every message, every whispered, "I love you" was a fragile lifeline. Neither of them knew that soon, those lifelines would be all Britt had left to hold on to. It was a morning like any other in Afghanistan. Heavy heat, tension in the air, a patrol moving along a well-worn path. Chris walked with sharp eyes and a heart torn between duty and daydreams of his growing family. Then it happened. In a flash, a blast tore the ground beneath him apart. ripping away dreams, promises, and the life he had so much left to live. At the base, after the chaos, there was only silence, the kind that presses down on you harder than any explosion. His brothers in arms knew the truth instantly. Somewhere across the ocean, a world was about to break apart. When Britt's phone rang, she already knew. Even before hearing the cold, official words, her body trembled with the weight of what was coming. Phrases like, with deepest regret and ultimate sacrifice sounded distant, like a movie she couldn't pause or walk away from. Britt collapsed onto the kitchen floor, clutching her small belly. Chris, the man who laughed at his own bad jokes, who spoke to their unborn child every night, wasn't coming home. There would be no airport hugs, no whispered promises in the dark. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of numbness. Everywhere she turned, reminders of Chris whispered through the house. His neatly packed bag, the videos he left behind, the texts she'd never get to answer. The future they had lovingly built now felt like a ghost she couldn't touch. Yet somehow, through the crushing grief, a small spark of strength flickered to life inside Britt. Deep down, she knew their story wasn't over, and that the tiny heartbeat she carried would become the living proof of a love too powerful to disappear. The months that followed dragged on like an endless winter. Each morning was a silent battle for Britt, a struggle to rise from the weight of grief that wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. Chris's laughter, once filling every corner of their home, now only echoed to the memories and shaky videos he left behind. But it was in those grainy clips, in his voice cracking jokes and whispering dreams of the baby, that Britt found the strength to keep breathing. It was almost as if, through those recordings, Chris was still there, reminding her that life, no matter how broken, was still worth living. On the darkest days, Britt would press play on one of his videos and let the tears fall freely. Chris would appear on the screen, that familiar crooked smile lighting up his face, talking about teaching their child to ride a bike or count the stars. Each word tore at her heart, but somehow stitched her back together at the same time. Britt created little rituals to survive. She listened to one of his messages before bed, placed the phone over her heart, and made silent promises to raise her child with all the love they had dreamed of. In those small acts, Britt found pieces of herself again. Slowly, Britt learned that healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about learning to carry it differently. She faced doctor's appointment alone, picked out baby clothes without a second opinion, and navigated lonely nights filled with quiet tears. But in every small, painful step, she grew stronger. She began writing letters to her unborn child, sharing stories of Chris's humor, bravery, and endless dreams. Without even realizing it, Britt was weaving an invisible thread connecting their past, their present, and the future they would soon step into. A future that would soon bring moments she never could predict it. The day their daughter was born was a tangled mix of emotions: love, grief, hope, and a bittersweet kind of joy. Britt held her tiny newborn close, and for a fleeting moment, she swore she could feel Chris right there beside her, whispering that everything would be okay. Tears streamed down her face as she smiled down at the baby, the weight of absence pressing as heavily as the miracle cradled in her arms. Chris's empty chair in the delivery room was impossible to ignore, but looking into her daughter's eyes, Britt found a familiar spark, a piece of Chris she would hold on to forever. The hospital staff, touched by the story behind the small, fierce arrival, moved with a reverent kind of care. Every cry from the baby was a declaration that life had won, even when grief had tried to suffocate it. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Britt held her newborn against her chest and whispered silent promises into the soft curls of her hair. She promised that her daughter would grow up knowing exactly how much she was loved by both parents. Deep inside, Britt knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but the strength Chris left behind in both of them would be more than enough. As the hospital days blurred into sleepless nights, Britt began adjusting to her new reality. It wasn't the future she and Chris had mapped out late at night in whispered conversations, but it was still full of the love they had built together. She chose the name Chris had loved the most, sealing a small part of him into their daughter's very identity. Every tiny milestone, the first yawn, the first sigh, was a treasure she held twice as tightly. And even as she stepped into this unknown world without him, Britt knew their story was far from over. In fact, the next chapter was just about to begin. Word about Chris's daughter's birth traveled quickly among his brothers in arms. Each of them carried invisible scars from losing him, and seeing that tiny new life stirred something deep inside them. It didn't take long for a plan to form, a silent agreement that they needed to honor Chris in a way as powerful as the bond they had shared. That's how the idea of a special tribute was born. A photo session, dressed in their formal uniforms, standing proudly with the child of the man they had loved like a brother. It wasn't just about remembering him, it was about keeping a promise. On the day of the shoot, the soldiers prepared as if gearing up for the most important mission of their lives. Every polished medal, every straightened collar, every carefully laced boot carried weight and reverence. When they arrived at the location, there was a stillness in the air, almost sacred. Britt, overwhelmed by emotion, gently placed her daughter into their arms that had once fought beside Chris, arms that now fought to hold back tears. For a few moments, the absence of Chris didn't feel quite so heavy. Surrounded by the men he called family, his daughter was wrapped in a living shield of love. As the cameras clicked, the soldiers posed with solemn expressions, torn between strength and raw emotion. Every salute, every tender glance at the baby, captured a silent vow. They would stand for her as they had once stood for him. Some cradled her with the gentleness of fathers. Others stood at attention, holding back the flood of feelings threatening to break through. Britt watched with a full, aching heart, realizing that Chris hadn't simply left. He had left behind a brotherhood larger and deeper than blood. And without knowing it, this powerful image would soon spark something even greater. When the first photos of the tribute hit social media, no one could have predicted the impact they would have. It was impossible to scroll past the image without feeling a lump form in your throat. A young mother in a vibrant red dress, holding her newborn, surrounded by a line of soldiers in full dress uniform, standing tall and proud. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, captured by the raw power of sacrifice, love, and loyalty, all wrapped into a single frame. Within hours, thousands were sharing the photos, commenting, crying. The story of Chris, Britt, and their daughter was spreading like wildfire. Every comment carried a piece of someone's heart. Strangers who had never worn a uniform thanked Chris for his service. Parents reached out to Britt, offering words of solidarity, comfort, and admiration. News outlets picked up the story, showcasing the photo as a symbol, not just one fallen soldier, but the enduring ties of family and brotherhood that outlast even death. Chris Harris's name traveled far beyond the small circle he had known in life. Through those images, his memory lived again, stitched into the fabric of a nation's collective heart. For Britt, the viral attention was bittersweet. It was comforting to know the world recognized a man she loved so deeply, but painful to reopen wounds with every article and every share. Still, she understood that something bigger was happening, that their story had become a beacon of empathy and hope. And in the spaces between each like, comment, and news clip, a quiet, powerful truth emerged. Even when life tears away what we hold most dear, love has a way of reaching farther, healing deeper, and building bridges stronger than we ever thought possible. And Britt's journey of honoring Chris was only just beginning. Over time, Britt realized she couldn't keep Chris's story or her own, tucked quietly away inside her heart. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it had changed shape, becoming something she could use to build bridges instead of walls. That's why, with shaking hands and a racing heart, she accepted her first invitation to speak publicly about resilience. Standing on stage, lights bright and crowd waiting, Britt felt the weight of her journey pressing down, but also the quiet certainty that she had something worth sharing. That day, without fully knowing it, she ignited sparks of hope in a room full of strangers. In every talk she gave, Britt poured pieces of her soul into the words. She spoke about the crushing sadness that almost swallowed her whole and the decision, made 100 tiny times, to keep going anyway. She told him about Chris, about the daughter he never got to meet, about the late nights when only his old videos kept her breathing. And as she shared, people wept and smiled through their tears, feeling less alone in their own battles. After every event, people lined up, not just to thank her, but to tell their own stories of loss, fear, and fierce, stubborn hope. The more Britt spoke, the more she healed. Each shared story, Each tearful hug at the end of a talk stitched new strength into her heart. It wasn't about moving on or forgetting Chris. It was about honoring him by living fully and helping others find their own reasons to stand back up. Britt realized that resilience wasn't about never breaking. It was about refusing to stay broken. And deep down, she knew Chris was still guiding her steps, leading her towards something even. Bigger on the horizon, Chris's daughter grew up surrounded by a love that was bigger than anything the world could take away. From her earliest days, Britt made sure her little girl knew who her father was. Not just a name etched in stone, but a real man who would laugh loudly, dream fearlessly, and love with his whole heart. To her, Chris wasn't a distant memory. He was a living presence, woven into bedtime stories, old videos, and pictures that filled their home. Every lesson about courage, loyalty, and love planted tiny seeds inside her, seeds that would grow into something beautiful and unshakable. Britt knew it wasn't enough to simply tell her daughter that Chris was a hero. She showed her what that meant through everyday actions, standing up for what's right, showing kindness even when it's hard, and loving without holding back. When her daughter asked about Chris, Britt didn't hide the sadness, but she also shared the laughter, the dreams, and the warmth he had left behind. On hard days, they lit candles together and shared something good they had done that day, a small but powerful ritual that kept Chris's spirit alive in their home. In those simple, sacred moments, Britt taught her daughter that grief and joy could exist side by side. As the years passed, Chris's daughter carried a spark in her eyes that reminded everyone of him. At school, she wasn't just known for her sharp mind. She was known for her heart, for standing up for others, for believing fiercely in kindness and loyalty. It was as if, in every small act of bravery and compassion, she was silently honoring the father she had never met. Britt watched her grow with a heart full of pride, knowing that Chris's legacy wasn't just a story of sacrifice. It was a living, breathing testament carried forward by the little girl who would one day show the world what true courage looks like. The auditorium was packed that fall afternoon, but when she stepped onto the stage, a deep hush fell over the room. Now a teenager, Chris's daughter wore her ceremonial uniform with a quiet pride that radiated from every step. She clutched her speech in steady hands, even though her heart thundered in her chest. Britt sat in the front row, tears already pooling in her eyes, remembering the tiny baby she once rocked in her arms. Now standing tall, ready to honor her father in a way no one would forget. This wasn't just a ceremony. It was a closing of a circle woven from pain, love, and resilience. When she spoke, her voice was soft but unwavering. She told the audience who Chris was to her. Not just a soldier, but a man who taught her, through his memory, that real strength meant keeping her heart open even after it's been broken. She talked about nights spent listening to his old recordings, about the ache of missing him, and about the pride she felt every time someone said his name. As her words filled the room, tears slipped down the faces of strangers and friends alike. Her speech wasn't just a tribute. It was a living, breathing reminder of what sacrifice, love, and legacy truly meant. When she finished, she stood tall and saluted, a gesture so powerful and tender that the entire auditorium rose to its feet in applause. It wasn't just respect they were offering, it was gratitude. Britt, standing proudly with tears streaming down her face, knew Chris would have been bursting with pride. In that moment, through the voice and bravery of their daughter, Chris's story found new life. And somewhere beyond the seen and the known, it was easy to imagine him smiling, whispering the words Britt had held on to for so long. Mission accomplished.